Hi, sophomores. Welcome to your new release. So, at this point, we have been working a lot on graphic design. You've gotten the chance to make a koala and friends, and then you got to make the chance to make an infographic over seminar. At this point, we are now going to do one more piece of graphic design before we move into our next unit. So in our next unit, we're going to learn all about sound design and how to produce podcasts and how to make music and everything with that sorts. So before we switch gears to that, I want you to think about if you had a podcast, well, what would that podcast be about? And what would you talk about? And what would the cover art look like? So I just told you that in the next unit, we're going to be producing podcasts. But before we get there, I want you to first decide what would the cover art for said podcast look like. So in this release, you're going to be designing something that we can use in our next unit. So think about if you had a podcast, what would you talk about? What would it be about? What would you cover? And what would you want your image to be that people could recognize? So when you're thinking about podcast cover art, there are some design principles that are going to make it be good. So you have a clear subject and theme. So the art instantly gives a hint of what the podcast is about. If it's a relationship, finance, storytelling, fitness, all of your visuals align. For example, using a picture of a host if it's a personality driven, or if it's topic focused, like using a graphic of that. So when someone is scrolling, like you have to think about this. If someone was scrolling and just looking really fast, they should be able to say, well, what is this? And it must immediately communicate what your podcast is about. Podcast cover art tend to be simple and legible. So the art will be shown typically when you're thinking of a normal podcast on a small like mobile thumbnail. So you want like bold, relatable elements. You don't want too much detail to get lost. Your text should be large enough, high contrast, minimal clutter. Then you're really focusing on like strong branding and consistent look. So you're going to be using colors, fonts, and images that align with your podcast voice. So if you were to already have like a brand, because a lot of podcasts will do, then that should be reflective of that. So start to think in that sense, right? Since we are creating podcasts in our next unit, well, what do you want that branding to look like? You should have good color and contrast. So you should make that your colors in your cover pop among any others, appropriate imagery. And I give you an example. So I listen to the podcast Crime Junkie, and it's a true crime podcast. And you can tell by the cover art, it is like dark and bold and serious, and it kind of helps set the expectations of what it's going to look like. So when you're thinking of yours, again, this is what we mean when we say your kind of mood for your podcast should match what you are designing. So this is your task for this release. So once you are done, you are going to be submitting your podcast cover art. Okay? And that will be it for this release. I will see you in the next one.